As is the case with, in particular, certain race cars in Unsung Heroes that we've looked at before and doubtless will look at again, it's more than just the occasional crash or background intrigue that can cause a car to lose a race, or to maybe not even start a race, not even finish a race. It can be sometimes more fundamental. Maybe a team just didn't have the time, or even the development bank account, to push the car really as far as they would have liked to. Even a company as big as Nissan, for instance, when they tried to develop the front-wheel drive GTR Nismo, they certainly had the money, but the car still wasn't ready to the point that they wanted it to be in that first Le Mans outing, and boy could you tell, the car did not perform as they wanted it to. Now on this occasion, it's more justifiable, because of course Lister, although a very famous name to any Gran Turismo player, is not exactly the same kind of size as Nissan. They don't have that kind of backing, that kind of funding, but what they do have is a lot of pluck, and that's one of the reasons why I like them. And when it comes to making race cars, not only do they have a lot of experience, but they do have a lot of success. The Lister Storm in GT racing is a force to be reckoned with, and for many Gran Turismo players, such as myself, that car in particular was our introduction to the brand. For 90s kids in particular, that was probably your introduction in either road or racing form. For me, it was Gran Turismo 2. Now this car, as you saw from the title of the video, actually shares that iconic name of the Storm. But this version is nothing like the Storm that you know, beyond that it's still a Lister. That's about all it has in common, because of course this is a full-on LMP. Now the car was developed for 2003, it ran in various forms up until 2006, and actually saw three major changes happen to it within that time. The first change was that this initial car was an LMP900, and it ended up being an LMP1, but also that it became a hybrid in mid-2005. So it had some interesting changes. Now, if you look up the car on Google, Lister LMP for instance, then you will find some that look different. In particular, there's a newer one with more of an F1-esque nose cone. Now that car is the hybrid, the later model, but personally, I'm not a fan of that one. I like this one a lot more because it's more oddball, it's more unique, it has more the kind of appearance that could divide opinion. And while we're on the topic of looks that divide opinion, this is actually something which I miss quite a lot from the earlier LMP eras of around the late 90s and the early 2000s with LMP900, and that is the variety. The cars just look so similar now under modern regulations that to me they're starting to get boring, whereas LMPs, GT1s from the 90s, of course Group Cs as well, there was lots of variety, lots of different approaches to the same fundamental set of rules, and that's what made it so cool. That's what makes any form of racing so cool, when you can have drastically different teams with completely different ideas going head to head, and still all of them, to some degree, more or less, making it work. And of course some cars winning, some cars not. Now in the case of this one, it actually did have some success. This is not a complete underdog story because the car did have a few podiums to its name. Now interestingly, as far as development goes, it was initially planned to have a Judd V10 engine, like a number of other prototypes had, including of course another name that will be very familiar to Gran Turismo players, Pescarolo. Again, very strong presence in the Le Mans, even though they've never actually won. Now, the car did not end up with that V10 engine, it ended up with a far more Panos LMP reminiscent 6-litre V8. Now personally, I would have loved it if it had ended up with the 7-litre V12 Jaguar engine that the Storm GT had, because not only would that have been very appropriate from a Lister Storm, but also it would have been a really nice homage to the Jaguar XJR9, which of course did win the Le Mans in 1988, but for whatever reasons it ended up with this 6-litre V8, and doubtless part of that at least was to do with the costs. Now, that wasn't the end of the issues that the car had. As far as just development, we're not even talking about its racing history yet. One of the other earlier issues was that their main sponsor, Essex Invest, left them in favour of Zytec. What a sellout, literally. So that's kind of a shame when your main sponsor drops out, doesn't exactly help the funding for the team, and unfortunately this theme of not having the money to make the car as good as it arguably could and should have been is a recurring one, and that's a shame for Lister because they really do have pluck. Lister is a very small company compared to many other exotics, but they make really cool cars, and for the most part very good ones, be it road cars or race cars. Now, what was the racing history? How did the car fare? Well, unfortunately, there are far more numbers that are lower down the grid, if not DNFs, for instance, but there are some notable podiums. Now, the first year that it ran, 2003, the best place that it achieved was unfortunately 16th. That's the best it got all year, and that was, funnily enough, in Le Mans testing. Then in 2004, though, things really changed. It didn't win everything across the board or even get podiums across the board, but what it did get was a 7th place, and then most notably its only victory of its entire 4-year career, which was notably in the 6 hours of Vallelunga. It did get first place, so that's something, at least for the car. Then in 2005, which incidentally it changed to a hybrid halfway through that year, it got a 2nd place. Guess where? Once again at the 6 hours of Vallelunga. So the car seems to have this very interesting relationship with that track because it's had its most success there by far. Now, in the last year of its run, 2006, the best that it achieved was a 3rd place, so once again a podium, very respectable, in the 1,000 kilometers of Istanbul. And although those 3 finishes in particular, 1st, 2nd and 3rd through 3 different years, sounds pretty impressive, of course, that's not as impressive in the grand scheme of things when there are multiple races. But unfortunately, the main thing that plagued the car over and over again was that lack of funding. Lister just can't afford to waste a ton of money as some teams could, like Mercedes or Nissan or Toyota or Porsche. They don't have that kind of backing. It's as simple as that. And it's a shame that when a team with so much spirit, so much pluck, and clearly an adeptness at racing, which they proved time and time again with the GT version of the Storm, that they just didn't have the chance to develop what could have been a much more successful car. Imagine if this had have been developed really as Lister intended it to, with potentially that Judd V10, it could have been even better. We obviously won't ever know, but it is cool at least that the car did get some podiums under its belt. It deserved at least that. Ultimately then, in late 2006, in fact at one of the Le Mans events, Lister announced that they would be shifting their attention away from LMP and moving more towards a new GT1 car, which of course for various rule reasons didn't exactly turn out, and ultimately that was the end of the LMP. At least for the moment. We'll have to see what the future holds. Ultimately, I really like the look of the initial version, the LMP900, with those 2 huge intakes on the front end, the very oddball light arrangement with the flat centerpiece. To me, it's kind of reminiscent of the Chrysler Dalaras, which I actually really like as well. They're the more oddball looking choice. And I have a lot of love for Lister as a brand anyway, as I know many of you guys do as well. So ultimately, as with some of the other race cars that we've talked about, it wasn't some radical earth-shattering thing, it was just a victim of time and money. Certainly unfortunate, but at least we can talk about it here and still appreciate what the car did do and what it potentially could have done also. But that's it for this pick, of course. If you want to check out all of the previous episodes, then you can click through at the end to do that, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.